In the last lesson, I mentioned the importance of what I call narrative structure in the music. Not an explicit story, but the general feeling of drawing the listener into a self-contained world where various musical characters interact in gradually intensifying ways before somehow arriving at a convincing resolution at the end. Just as in prose, creating a sustained, convincing narrative is a technical challenge. Here I want to explore one of the most important techniques required for this task. I call it yes, but. Any piece of music lasting more than a few seconds requires punctuation, since human memory is limited. Our short-term memory lasts only a few seconds, so music with no punctuation quickly becomes incoherent, impossible to grasp. Imagine trying to read a newspaper article without headlines, paragraphs, periods, or commas. Similarly, music needs punctuation to be comprehensible and memorable. And in a larger piece, where contrast is a necessity to avoid boredom, the listener needs clear signposts to keep on track. But once we have punctuation, the challenge is to let the music breathe, but not to lose all momentum. This is especially important in larger forms that require maintaining at least some level of suspense up to the end. What this requires is sensitivity to degrees of punctuation. The ability to say, in effect, to the listener, "We'll take a moment's pause here, but after that there's something really interesting coming up." I call this technique yes, but. Let's see how this works in practice. Our first example would be from the first movement of Mozart's G minor symphony, K550. Most analysis courses consider punctuation to be a matter of harmony and cadences, but for the composer, it's more complicated than that. There are many levels of punctuation, ranging from the strongest, normally at the end of the piece, to almost unnoticeable on a local level. If we look at the Mozart now, the melody has a short pause in measure 3. This is just rhythmic, since the harmony has not changed at all. This helps break the melody into easily memorable melodic segments. But the accompaniment keeps going. There are several more of these little breaths before the first harmonic cadence in measure 9. Here, the bass line creates the strongest punctuation up to this point, an imperfect authentic cadence. In the following bars, the same motive takes a new turn. It seems about to arrive at a cadence in measure 14, but the D in the top line turns out to be the 7th of the chord, which needs to resolve onto the C sharp in the next bar. This is a frequent technique for creating the yes but feeling. One part arrives at the expected note, but another, often the bass, does something else that creates suspense instead of arriving at a clear resolution. The expected dominant does indeed arrive in measure 16, alternating several times with the dissonant chord right before it, marking this as the strongest punctuation so far in the piece. Note the sforzando indication on the dissonant chord, emphasizing its tension. The alternation speeds up in measure 19 before settling down on the dominant at the start of measure 20. This cadence on the dominant is mitigated by the legato bassoons, overlapping as the melody seems to be restarting. This kind of overlap is another very common way to maintain music's momentum. It's subtle but powerful. Imagine if the music had simply stopped on the first beat of measure 20. Now we begin the second paragraph. It starts like the first, but it takes a new turn in measure 24, via a slightly different harmony from that in measure 5. Measure 27 seems to be heading for a cadence in B-flat major, But although the expected chord arrives, it's suddenly loud, and it turns out to be the start of a new theme. This kind of elision, overlap between two ideas, is another powerful means of creating momentum, instead of allowing the music to lose energy. Measure 38 could be a cadence, if we only look at the harmony, but the accompaniment in eighth notes keeps going and the melody clearly is not complete. The next important punctuation occurs at measure 42. We've arrived here at the dominant of B flat major, and the music is a strong dramatic stop. But the harmony is stopping on a dominant chord. Also note on the next idea, in measure 44, starts with a contrast, legato and quiet, maintaining the listener's curiosity, although the B flat tonic has arrived. Let's listen. What all these punctuations have in common is that there's always at least one element in the music, articulation, dynamics, rhythm, motives, harmony, etc., that doesn't do what we expect. These little surprises are the key to keeping the music alive and creating the yes but feeling. Now let's look at a short example from Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra from the end of the introduction. This transition is an accelerando into the main allegro, which starts at measure 76. In the first part of the transition, from measure 58 to 62, the motive here, the bass clef, acts as an ostinato bass under other thematic material. Then, in measure 63, the upper winds add the variant and the treble clef at the same time, repeating it obsessively during a crescendo that also speeds up. At the height of the crescendo, in measure 75, there's a short pause, and then the following theme arrives, along with the new tempo in measure 76. Obviously, the beginning of this new theme comes from the previous ostinato. What's interesting here is that pause right before the new section. It marks the end of the introduction, making the crescendo accelerando sound like a giant upbeat to the allegro, which then acts like what some theorists call a structural downbeat. The pause creates a moment of suspense for the listener, who then questions what will happen next. An important punctuation becomes a very suspenseful moment. Let's listen to this transition. Finally, a more recent example, the start of my own Fourth Symphony. The opening idea here is a combination of a sustained string melody with a brooding timpani motive. The first, very mild punctuation arrives in measure 5, the long F in the strings. The timpani rhythm maintains the momentum. The next punctuation arrives in measure 9, when the timpani E flat resolves to D. However, the string melody overlaps, so there's no loss of energy. Measure 13 arrives at another cadence, a longer note value, as the melody descends onto C, underlined by a diminuendo. But this measure has been shortened to 3/4 time, so the C only lasts 2 beats, then the horns arrive with a new variant of the material. The strongest punctuation up to this point arrives in measure 21, where all the instruments pause and where the rhythm in the horns is slowed down to quarter notes. Note that the descending line in horn 1 doesn't feel like a full stop, but rather like a gentle breath. And after only 1 beat of silence, the trumpet accent sets off an answering paragraph where the original string idea accompanies a new clarinet solo. Again, the point of all these examples is that punctuation within a given movement is virtually always tempered, called into question by some other element of the music to prevent premature closure. When we examine musical punctuation in a large work, it's essential not just to label it, but to note the degree of punctuation, and especially which aspects of the music create curiosity about what's coming next. Yes, but